Ida for telling my ex to give me full custody of our kids if she wants my help and saying that's the only help I'd ever offer her. It all started with what I thought was a normal relationship, a partnership founded on love, trust, and the shared joy of building a family together. At 34 years old, I found myself standing at a crossroads, reflecting on the unraveling of the life I had envisioned with my former partner. Together, we had brought 2 sons into the world, each with their own unique personalities and quirks, each carrying the innocence and curiosity that only children possess. My eldest son, who was 11, was growing into a thoughtful, observant boy, often watching the world with a quiet intensity that made me proud and a little protective. My younger son, just 9 years old, had a spark of mischief in his eyes and a boundless energy that filled any room he entered. For a long time, I believed we were a complete family. I believed in the life we had built, the routines, the memories, the laughter. But life has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. I learned that my partner, my ex, had been cheating on me with a man named Luke. The revelation hit me like a freight train, shattering the image of stability and happiness I had clung to. There were no signs, or perhaps I had been too trusting to see them. I had trusted her implicitly, and in return, I was left with the bitter taste of betrayal. The moment I confronted her about the affair, her demeanor shifted. There was no apology, no remorse, only a strange sort of defiance, as though she had prepared herself for this fallout. What surprised me most was that she didn't fight me when I made the decision to leave. She didn't beg for forgiveness, didn't try to salvage what was left of our relationship. Instead, she seemed resigned, as though she had already chosen her path, one that did not include me. It wasn't until weeks later that she reached out again, this time with an announcement that changed everything. She was pregnant. The news, delivered without any trace of warmth or excitement, was followed by a revelation that Luke, the man she had chosen over me, had vanished. He had left her, just as quickly as he had entered her life. Desperation laced her voice as she attempted to bridge the chasm between us. She claimed the child was mine, suggesting that we should try to make things work for the sake of our growing family. But her words fell on deaf ears. The wounds of betrayal were still fresh, and the trust that once formed the foundation of our relationship was beyond repair. I told her, calmly and without hesitation, that if the child was truly mine, we would need to confirm it through a DNA test. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for blind faith anymore. And even if the child turned out to be mine, there was no future for us as a couple. The love we once shared had been irreparably tainted by deceit. As time passed, she gave birth to a daughter, a fragile, innocent baby who bore no blame for the circumstances of her arrival. Yet, when the DNA test results came in, the truth was laid bare. The child was not mine. The relief I felt was tempered by a lingering sadness. I knew this meant my ex's life was about to become even more complicated. She was now a single mother to 3 children, each with a different story, each with a different father or lack thereof. We weren't married, a small mercy that spared me from legal entanglements involving birth certificates and custody battles over a child who wasn't mine. But even so, my ex attempted to weave me into her narrative. She tried to put my name on her daughter's birth certificate, a futile effort that was swiftly rejected by the authorities. It was a desperate act, born of a need to fill the void left by Luke's absence, to create an illusion of stability for her daughter. Our co-parenting arrangement became increasingly strained in the aftermath. The trust we once shared had dissolved into suspicion and resentment. Every interaction felt like a battlefield, each word exchanged laced with tension. It wasn't long before we found ourselves unable to communicate effectively, the weight of our history too heavy to bear. The courts intervened, recognizing the toxicity of our interactions. They mandated that we use a parenting app to facilitate our conversations, a digital buffer designed to minimize conflict. The app became our lifeline, the only acceptable means of communication unless there was a true emergency. We could text, email, or call if necessary, but neither party was required to respond unless the situation warranted immediate attention. This arrangement brought a semblance of peace to my life, a barrier that shielded me from her relentless attempts to wear me down. She hated the app. It stripped her of the power she once held over me, preventing her from manipulating our interactions to suit her needs. She could no longer bombard me with messages, hoping to erode my resolve. But even with the app in place, her persistence remained. She wanted me to accept her daughter, to take on the role of a father figure, despite knowing the truth. She believed that by appealing to my sense of responsibility, she could guilt me into compliance. But I stood firm. I had 2 sons, 2 boys who needed my love, guidance, and support. My focus was on them, on providing a stable, nurturing environment in which they could thrive. As the months rolled on, her attempts grew more desperate. She used every tool at her disposal, weaving elaborate stories in the hopes of swaying me. But I refused to be drawn into her web of deceit. I knew where my responsibilities lay, and they did not extend to a child who was not my own. I would not allow her to blur the lines between truth and fiction, to rewrite the narrative of our lives to suit her agenda. The situation reached a boiling point when she began using our sons as pawns in her game. She tried to poison their perception of me, to sow seeds of doubt and discord. It was a cruel, calculated tactic, one designed to fracture the bond we shared. But my sons saw through her manipulations. Our relationship, built on a foundation of love and trust, remained unshaken. They knew who their father was, and no amount of interference could change that. Still, the damage was done. The emotional toll on my boys was evident, their innocence tainted by the adult conflicts they were forced to witness. I knew I had to take action, to protect them from the chaos their mother continued to create. The courts, once again, became our battleground. I sought to modify our custody arrangement, to shield my sons from the turmoil that plagued their mother's life. The first attempt was met with resistance. The judge, perhaps weary of our ongoing disputes, refused to alter the custody arrangement. Undeterred, I tried again and again, each time presenting evidence of the harm being done to my sons. The therapist's reports painted a clear picture of the emotional strain they were under, yet the courts remained hesitant to make a change. The judges, in their wisdom or perhaps their weariness, upheld the 50-50 custody split, despite the growing evidence that my home provided the stability my sons so desperately needed. Each rejection felt like a blow, but I refused to give up. My sons deserved better, and I would continue to fight for their well-being, no matter how long it took. About 2 years after our already fractured CO-parenting relationship had settled into a tenuous rhythm, she began dating a man named Sean. Sean arrived in her life like a whirlwind, bringing with him a presence that seemed, at least initially, to bring her some semblance of stability. For a brief moment, I thought perhaps things would finally improve. Maybe, with someone else taking up space in her life, the endless attempts to drag me into her chaos would cease. And for a short time, it seemed like that might be the case. What struck me most about Sean wasn't his sudden appearance, but the way he instantly stepped into the role of her daughter's real dad. Just like that, Luke was erased from the narrative, and Sean became the father figure that my ex wanted so desperately for her daughter. It was as if Luke had never existed, as if the tumultuous circumstances of her birth had been swept away and replaced by a new, more palatable version of events. It was strange to watch from the sidelines, but I can't deny that I welcomed the peace it brought me. For the first time in years, I experienced a kind of calm. With Sean now taking on the mantle of responsibility for her daughter, the relentless push to make me accept her as my own faded into the background. I no longer had to endure guilt-laden messages or the emotional manipulation that had defined so many of our interactions. Sean's presence gave me a reprieve from the chaos that had been my constant companion since our breakup. But as with all things involving my ex, the peace was short-lived. At first, Sean kept his distance from my sons. He wasn't particularly interested in being a stepfather to them, which suited me just fine. I didn't want or need another man trying to step into my role in their lives. But as time went on, I began to notice subtle changes. My ex, never content to let things lie, started making small, calculated moves to involve Sean in my son's lives in ways that felt intrusive and unnecessary. They tried to create division where none existed. There were attempts to undermine the bond I had with my boys, to paint me as the villain in their eyes. My ex, with Sean by her side, would make disparaging comments about me, hoping that my sons would internalize them. But what they failed to understand was that my relationship with my boys was built on a foundation of trust and love. No amount of manipulation could erode that. My sons saw through the lies and half-truths. They knew who I was, and they knew the lengths I went to in order to protect them and provide for them. The relationship between my ex and Sean lasted about 2.5 years, maybe 3. It was hard to keep track, given how little I paid attention to the specifics of their personal life. My focus was always on my sons and ensuring that they were shielded from the turbulence of their mother's ever-changing relationships. But it was impossible not to notice when things began to unravel between them. Predictably, my ex ended up pregnant again. Sean, who had initially embraced the role of father to her daughter, was now faced with the reality of having a child of his own with her. And just as quickly as he had stepped into her life, he stepped out. He left her with a newborn son, disappearing into the same ether that Luke had vanished into years before. History was repeating itself, and once again, my ex found herself alone, raising children from multiple fathers, each with their own complicated stories. And just like before, she turned to me. This time, her desperation was palpable. She wasn't just asking for help, she was demanding it. She wanted me to take on her other children, to provide for them, to become the constant in their lives that their biological fathers refused to be. But I held firm. I had drawn my boundaries long ago, and I wasn't about to let her blur them again. My responsibility was to my sons and my sons alone. Her tactics became more aggressive. She tried to poison our boys against me once more, using emotional manipulation to paint herself as the victim and me as the villain who refused to step up. She would say things like, "Your dad doesn't care about your siblings," hoping to elicit some form of guilt or doubt in their minds. But my sons, having grown wiser and more perceptive over the years, weren't swayed by her words. Their loyalty remained with me, not out of obligation, but because they knew the truth. They saw the lengths I went to for them, the sacrifices I made to ensure their well-being. They understood that my refusal to take on their mother's other children wasn't a reflection of my character, but a necessary boundary to protect our family dynamic. The situation escalated to the point where the courts had to intervene once again. I provided documentation of her attempts at alienation, along with reports from the therapist who had been working with my sons. The therapist's notes were clear: my sons were struggling with the emotional turmoil their mother was causing. They were being pulled in too many directions, caught in the crossfire of their mother's personal battles. The court, recognizing the harm being done, ordered my ex to attend therapy and parenting classes. She needed to address her behavior and learn how to separate her personal struggles from her role as a mother. The judge made it clear that there would be consequences if she continued down this path. Monetary fines would be imposed if she engaged in alienation tactics again. It wasn't the full custody I had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. One small victory came from this legal battle: I was able to secure therapy for my sons. It was a crucial step in helping them process the chaos they had been exposed to. The sessions provided them with a safe space to express their emotions, to navigate the complexities of their family dynamics without fear of judgment or retribution. The therapist became an invaluable ally in our journey. They helped my sons build resilience, teaching them how to set their own boundaries and protect their emotional well-being. They learned that they weren't responsible for their mother's actions or her other children. They learned that it was okay to love their mom while also recognizing her flaws and the impact her behavior had on their lives. As I watched my sons grow stronger and more self-assured, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The chaos that had once dominated our lives was beginning to subside. My sons were finding their voices, standing firm in their identities, and understanding that they had the power to shape their own futures. But even with the progress we had made, I knew the battle wasn't over. My ex would always be a part of our lives, and with her came the potential for more upheaval. But I was prepared. I had fought too hard and come too far to let her unravel the stability we had built. My sons and I stood together, a united front against the storms that life and their mother might throw our way. And no matter what came next, I knew we would face it together, stronger and more resilient than ever before. Anytime one of our boys had an event, be it a school play, a soccer match, or a parent-teacher meeting, I dreaded the inevitable tension that would follow. It wasn't because I didn't want to be there for my sons. Quite the opposite. I took pride in showing up for them, cheering them on, and celebrating their achievements. But my ex had a way of making these occasions uncomfortable, injecting her chaos into what should have been moments of joy. Without fail, she would try to sit near me, positioning herself in such a way that made it seem, to the outside world, that we were still a family unit. It was a manipulative move, one designed to blur the lines and create a false narrative for those who didn't know the truth. She was adept at playing the role of the devoted mother, the woman who co-parented seamlessly with her ex. But I knew better, and so did my sons. The most troubling part was the way she involved her daughter in these performances. Her daughter, who had been born out of an affair and had no biological connection to me, had been convinced by my ex that I was her father. This lie had been perpetuated for years, and I could see the confusion it caused in the little girl's eyes. She would look up at me with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, searching for some sign of recognition, some acknowledgement that I was who she had been told I was. It was heartbreaking. But as much as it hurt to see a child caught in the crossfire of her mother's manipulations, I refused to play along. I wouldn't be complicit in this lie. I told my ex, repeatedly and firmly, that she needed to correct it. It wasn't fair to her daughter to grow up believing a falsehood, nor was it fair to my sons to have their relationship with me distorted by the presence of a child who wasn't theirs to call a sibling. My ex, predictably, dismissed my concerns. She believed that if she pushed hard enough, if she created enough emotional pressure, I would eventually relent. She thought I would take on her daughter out of pity or guilt. But I didn't. I couldn't. The boundaries I had set were firm, and I wasn't going to allow her to manipulate me into taking on responsibilities that weren't mine. Her son, who was younger, was largely oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. He was too little to understand the complexities of the situation, and for that, I was grateful. But as he grew older, I knew that he, too, would become entangled in the web of lies his mother had spun. It was inevitable, and the thought of it weighed heavily on me. Despite the emotional toll, I never wavered in my commitment to my sons. I fought for them every step of the way, both in the courtroom and in our daily lives. Over the years, I filed for more custody, even full custody, on 4 separate occasions. Each time, I presented evidence of the harm my ex was causing. I provided documentation of her attempts to alienate our sons from me, reports from the therapist outlining the boys' distress, and statements from teachers and other adults who had witnessed the impact of her behavior. The therapist, in particular, was a key ally. They had spent countless hours with my sons, listening to their fears, frustrations, and wishes. The boys were clear in their desire to live primarily with me. They hated the environment at their mother's house. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and emotionally taxing. They craved the stability and security they found in my home, a home where their needs were prioritized, where they could be themselves without the burden of their mother's drama hanging over them. Yet, despite all of this, the courts remained steadfast in their refusal to alter our custody arrangement. The 2 judges we had seen so far both ruled against me. They upheld the 50-50 custody split, citing the importance of maintaining a relationship with both parents. It was a frustrating, disheartening outcome each time. I couldn't understand how the courts could look at the evidence, listen to the testimony of professionals, and still conclude that an equal split was in the best interest of my sons. I wasn't trying to erase their mother from their lives. I wasn't trying to punish her or seek revenge. I simply wanted what was best for my boys, and it was painfully obvious to everyone except the judges. It seemed that they would thrive in my care. The courtroom battles were draining, both emotionally and financially. Each time, I walked away feeling defeated, questioning whether I was doing the right thing. But my resolve never wavered. I knew, deep down, that I was fighting for my son's well-being, and that was worth every ounce of effort. The rulings didn't change the reality of the situation at home. My ex continued to create problems, using our sons as pawns in her ongoing attempts to manipulate me. She would make false promises to them, tell them lies about me, and try to create distance between us. But the bond I shared with my boys was unbreakable. They saw through her games. They knew who I was, and they trusted me implicitly. I made it a point to be present in their lives as much as possible. I attended every school event, every game, every important moment. I was there to listen when they needed to talk, to offer guidance when they faced challenges, and to celebrate their successes, big or small. The boys knew they could count on me, and that consistency became a lifeline for them. It provided a sense of stability amid the chaos of their mother's world. They thrived in my care, growing into confident, resilient young men who understood the value of honesty, integrity, and unconditional love. And yet, my ex continued her attempts to chip away at that stability. She couldn't accept that her manipulations weren't working. She couldn't stand the fact that her efforts to turn the boys against me were failing. It drove her to greater lengths, escalating the conflict in ways that became increasingly destructive. But no matter what she did, I stood firm. I knew that one day, the boys would be old enough to make their own decisions about where they wanted to live. I knew that they would see the truth for themselves, without the interference of judges or court orders. And when that day came, I would be there, ready to welcome them with open arms. Until then, I would keep fighting for them, for their well-being, and for the future they deserved. Because they were my sons, and I would do whatever it took to protect them from the chaos their mother continued to create. Now, my ex is married again. The pattern continues. She found someone new, and with that, the cycle of temporary stability followed by inevitable chaos began all over again. This time, her new husband seemed more grounded at first glance, someone who might stick around long enough to provide some sort of lasting presence in her ever-growing web of fractured relationships. They had a child together, a daughter. For a short time, he appeared to take on the role of a stepfather to her other two children from previous relationships, showing interest and care, or at least a willingness to coexist with them. But then, predictably, the cracks began to show. Her husband slowly distanced himself from her older children, the ones who weren't biologically his. It became obvious, even during my limited interactions with him, that his patience was wearing thin. I saw it in the way he avoided eye contact with her older kids, the way his tone shifted when he addressed them or, more accurately, when he didn't address them at all. He wasn't cruel, but he was indifferent. And in family dynamics, indifference can be just as damaging as outright hostility. I would only see these interactions briefly, during drop-offs or pick-ups, but it was enough to paint a clear picture. Her husband's affection and attention were reserved solely for his biological daughter. The other kids, her daughter from Luke and her son from Sean, seemed to fade into the background. They became burdens, reminders of a past he wasn't part of and didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't surprising, really. These children had been caught in the revolving door of their mother's relationships, each man in her life treating them like afterthoughts once the initial glow of the relationship wore off. And so, the inevitable happened. My ex began texting me about it. She poured out her frustrations in lengthy, emotional messages. She told me how her husband no longer wanted to be involved with her other children, how he barely acknowledged them anymore. She described the tension in her household, the way her home had become a battleground of unmet expectations and resentments. Her once hopeful attempts to create a blended family had crumbled, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. I didn't respond to her messages. Not a single one. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't feed into her narrative of victimhood or open the door for more manipulation. Her problems weren't mine to fix. I wasn't responsible for her choices, her relationships, or the fallout from them. My sole focus was on our sons and ensuring they had the stability and security they needed to thrive. One of my 4 attempts to gain full custody of my sons came during this time. In one of her text messages, which I saved as evidence, she admitted that her household was hell. She described the emotional toll it was taking on her children, acknowledging that they were suffering. It was a damning statement, one that should have been enough to sway any reasonable judge in my favor. But once again, the judge denied my request. It was infuriating. I had laid everything out clearly: the instability of her home, the emotional distress it caused our sons, and the fact that I was more than capable of providing a better, more consistent environment for them. The therapist supported my petition, stating that the boys would benefit from spending more time with me. And yet, the court continued to uphold the 50-50 custody arrangement, as though maintaining a theoretical balance was more important than addressing the very real harm being done to my children. Despite the court's decision, my ex's situation continued to deteriorate. Her new marriage was strained, her household tense and fractured, and in her desperation, she turned to me once more. She asked me to step up for her other 2 kids. She pleaded for my help, painting a picture of their suffering and how much they needed a stable, fatherly figure in their lives. She tried to appeal to my sense of duty, my responsibility as a father, and my empathy as a human being. But I stood my ground. My answer was and always would be no. I told her the only help I would give was to take full custody of our boys. That was the extent of my offer. If she truly cared about what was best for them, she would agree to let them live primarily with me. But her reaction was exactly what I expected. She freaked out. She accused me of trying to separate our sons from their family, of wanting to destroy the sibling bonds they had with her other children. She made it sound as though I was the one driving a wedge between them, as though my refusal to take on her other children was somehow harming our boys. But let me be clear, there was no strong sibling bond between my sons and her other 3 children. The therapist had confirmed this in their sessions. My boys didn't have a particularly close relationship with their half-siblings. They saw them during their time at their mother's house, but beyond that, there was little connection. They were polite, but distant. There was no deep emotional attachment that would be shattered if they spent more time with me and less with their mother's ever-changing household dynamic. The truth was, my boys craved stability. They wanted predictability, routine, and a sense of security, all things they found in my home. They didn't need to be part of the chaos their mother brought into their lives with each new relationship. They needed peace. Still, my ex refused to see it that way. She was desperate to keep her fractured family together, clinging to the idea that I should be the one to bridge the gaps her choices had created. She called me cruel, selfish, and heartless for taking such a hard stance. She accused me of turning my back on children in need, of prioritizing my pride over their well-being. But I didn't see it that way. I wasn't responsible for her choices or the consequences of those choices. I had my own children to protect and prioritize. My sons were my focus, and everything I did was for their benefit. So, am I the asshole for refusing to help with her other kids? For saying no when she begged me to take on responsibilities that weren't mine? I don't think so. I'm a father to 2 amazing boys. I've fought for them, protected them, and provided for them every step of the way. I've endured years of manipulation, legal battles, and emotional strain to ensure they have the stability and love they deserve. My responsibility begins and ends with them. I don't regret my decision to draw firm boundaries. I don't regret standing up for myself and my sons, even when it meant facing harsh criticism from my ex. In the end, I know I've done what's best for my boys. As for her other children, they aren't my responsibility. My ex made her choices, and those choices came with consequences. It's not my job to fix the mess she created. My focus remains where it always has, on my sons, ensuring they grow up in a stable, loving environment where they can thrive, free from the chaos their mother continues to bring into her life. So, am I the asshole? I don't believe I am.